There's a particular kind of pain that comes with watching your own life become foreign to you, watching the spaces you've carefully created for love slowly fill with indifference. I'm 58 years old, and I thought I understood heartbreak when my husband Richard passed away 3 years ago. I thought I knew what it meant to lose someone, but losing someone to death is clean, final. You grieve, you heal, you honor their memory. Losing someone who's still alive, someone who looks through you as if you're already a ghost, that's a different kind of dying. My name is Fiona, and this is the story of how I learned that sometimes the people who should protect your heart are the ones who break it most completely. The house on Maple Street had been our sanctuary for 27 years. Richard and I had painted every wall, planted every flower in the garden, chosen every piece of furniture with the kind of careful attention that comes from believing you're building something permanent. When Lucas was born, we added a nursery with pale yellow walls because we wanted to be surprised by the gender. Later, we converted it to a playroom, then a teenager's bedroom, watching our son grow within these walls that held our laughter, our arguments, our quiet Sunday mornings reading newspapers in bed. After Richard's funeral, Lucas had insisted I shouldn't live alone. "Mom, you need family around you," he'd said, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd developed in his late 20s, the voice of a man who believed he knew what was best for everyone. "Amanda and I want you here with us. This is your home." Amanda, my daughter-in-law of 2 years, who smiled at me with her perfectly white teeth and eyes that never quite reached the warmth her voice promised. She was beautiful in the way that made other women unconsciously check their own appearance, with honey blonde hair that always looked professionally styled and clothes that suggested she'd never worn anything that wasn't chosen with careful consideration for how it would be perceived by others. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. At first, the arrangement seemed natural, even comforting. Lucas had always been my gentle boy, the kind of child who brought me dandelions he'd picked from the yard and called them flowers for the prettiest mom in the world. He'd grown into a successful accountant, methodical and caring, the kind of man who remembered my birthday and called every Sunday without fail. When he'd married Amanda, I'd tried so hard to see what he saw in her confidence, her ambition, her way of making everything around her seem more organized and efficient. But efficiency, I learned, could be a cold comfort when it came at the expense of warmth. The changes started small, almost imperceptible. Amanda would rearrange the living room furniture while I was out grocery shopping, explaining with that bright smile that she was just trying to optimize the flow of the space. The family photos that had covered the mantelpiece for decades were reduced to a select few, the rest packed away because clutter makes everything feel so chaotic, don't you think, Fiona? My grandmother's china cabinet, which had held the dishes Richard and I received as wedding gifts, was moved to the basement. "We need the space for our new entertainment center," Amanda explained, her voice carrying that patient tone people use when they're explaining something to someone they consider intellectually inferior. And honestly, those old patterns are so dated. "I found these gorgeous modern pieces that will really update the whole room." I said nothing. What could I say? It was Lucas's house now, his marriage, his life. I was grateful to have somewhere to live, grateful not to be alone in my grief, grateful that my son wanted to take care of me. I told myself these changes were normal, that young couples needed to make a space their own, that I was being overly sentimental about objects that were, after all, just things. But they weren't just things. They were the physical evidence of a life I'd built with purpose and love, the tangible proof that I had mattered to someone, that my choices and preferences had once been not just acknowledged, but celebrated. Richard used to joke that I was a nester, someone who could make any space feel like home within days. He'd loved watching me arrange and rearrange our belongings, creating small vignettes that told the story of our family, our travels, our shared history. Now I watch those stories being erased, one small change at a time, as if my life before Amanda had been merely a rough draft that required editing by someone with better taste and more modern sensibilities. The kitchen, which had been my domain for over 2 decades, became Amanda's project. She replaced my well-seasoned cast-iron pans with sleek stainless steel cookware that looked beautiful, but somehow made every meal taste less like home. The spice rack I'd carefully organized over years of cooking family dinners was replaced with matching glass containers labeled with a label maker, each one perfectly aligned and alphabetized. "I know change is hard," Amanda said one evening as I stood looking at the unfamiliar kitchen, searching for the paprika in its new logical location. "But you'll see how much more efficient everything is now. I've optimized the whole workflow." Optimized. As if my way of cooking, the methods I'd used to feed my family for decades, had been somehow deficient, in need of correction by someone who viewed the kitchen as a problem to be solved rather than a space to be loved. I nodded and smiled, because what else do you do when someone has rearranged your life with such confident efficiency? I thanked her for her thoughtfulness, complimented her organizational skills, and quietly grieved for the small rituals that had made cooking feel like an act of love rather than a task to be optimized. The dinner table conversations became exercises in careful navigation, topics chosen and guided by Amanda's preferences and opinions. She had strong views about everything: which restaurants were acceptable, which movies were worth watching, which vacation destinations offered the best combination of luxury and Instagram-worthy photo opportunities. Lucas, who had once enjoyed our long conversations about books and gardening and the small pleasures of daily life, now seemed to defer to his wife's more sophisticated tastes. "Mom still thinks that little diner on 5th Street is fine dining," Amanda would say with a laugh that sounded affectionate but felt dismissive. "It's so sweet how some people are just comfortable with simple things." Simple things. As if contentment with life's smaller pleasures was a character flaw rather than a choice. As if my satisfaction with a good book and a cup of coffee on a quiet morning was evidence of limited aspirations rather than genuine appreciation for what I had. Lucas would chuckle along with her observations, and something inside me would shrink a little more each time. Not because I minded being teased. Richard and I had spent decades playfully mocking each other's quirks and preferences, but because Lucas's laughter felt like agreement, like he too had begun to see me through Amanda's eyes. A sweet but provincial woman whose simple tastes needed to be managed and gently mocked rather than respected and valued. The erosion of love doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow wearing away, like water against stone. So gradual you don't notice until one day you look up and realize the landscape has completely changed. The son who once called me every Sunday began to forget. The weekly grocery shopping trips we'd shared since his father's death became inconvenient interruptions to his schedule. The quiet moments we'd treasured, watching old movies together, sharing stories about his childhood, became extinct, replaced by Amanda's more stimulating social calendar. "Lucas is just so busy with work right now," Amanda would explain when I'd mention missing our time together. "He needs to focus on building his career, not getting bogged down in, well, you know how it is. Some people need more space to grow. Some people." As if I was the obstacle preventing my son from reaching his full potential. As if my presence in his life was holding him back from achievements that would only be possible without me weighing him down. The first Christmas after they moved in should have been joyful. Instead, it became a masterclass in polite exclusion. Amanda had very specific ideas about holiday traditions, and none of them included the rituals Lucas and I had built over 29 years. The stockings I'd hand-knitted when he was a baby, each one featuring his favorite cartoon characters from different ages, were replaced with elegant cream-colored ones from an expensive boutique. "These will photograph so much better," Amanda explained, arranging them on the mantelpiece with the precision of a magazine stylist. The Christmas morning breakfast I'd prepared for Lucas every year since he could hold a fork, his father's recipe for cinnamon French toast with homemade maple syrup, was replaced with something Amanda called a festive brunch spread, featuring exotic fruits and artisanal pastries that looked beautiful but tasted like expensive cardboard. "Mom's cooking is so hearty," Amanda said to Lucas, the word hearty delivered with the same tone someone might use to describe a particularly ungainly piece of furniture. "But I thought we should try something more sophisticated this year. More adult. More adult." As if the food I'd prepared with love for 3 decades had been somehow childish, inappropriate for the mature couple they'd become. Lucas nodded approvingly as he bit into a croissant that had probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries for a week, and I watched him discover what I'd learned about expensive things. They often look impressive but rarely nourish the soul. My gifts, carefully chosen from my limited budget and wrapped with the same care I'd always taken, seemed shabby next to Amanda's elaborate presentations. She gave Lucas expensive electronics and designer clothes, items that announced their cost and sophistication. I gave him books I thought he'd enjoy, a photo album filled with pictures from his childhood, a scarf I'd knitted during the long evenings when I couldn't sleep for missing his father. "Oh, how thoughtful," Amanda said as Lucas unwrapped my gifts, her voice carrying that particular kind of patronizing warmth that made compliments feel like insults. Homemade things are so personal, aren't they? So much more meaningful than just buying something expensive. But Lucas's enthusiasm for my gifts seemed forced, polite rather than genuine, as if he too had begun to equate value with price tags and sophistication with store-bought perfection. The books I'd chosen based on conversations we'd had throughout the year sat unopened on his bedside table for months. The photo album disappeared into a closet somewhere, replaced by Amanda's digital picture frames that cycled through carefully curated images of their social life, dinner parties with his colleagues, weekend trips to places I'd never been, moments that didn't include me. The breaking point should have been dramatic, marked by raised voices and slammed doors. Instead, it arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in February, wrapped in the kind of casual cruelty that's often more devastating than outright hostility. I'd been feeling unwell for several days. Nothing serious, just the kind of winter cold that settles in your chest and makes everything feel more difficult than it should. I'd been trying to manage quietly, not wanting to be a burden, dosing myself with over-the-counter medications and trying to rest when I could without disrupting the household routine that Amanda had so carefully optimized. That morning, I'd asked Lucas if he might pick up some ingredients for chicken soup when he went to the store. It was such a small request, the kind of thing he would have done automatically when his father was alive, the kind of care family members provide for each other without thinking twice. "Actually, Mom," he said, not looking up from his phone where he was scrolling through work emails, "Amanda thinks it might be better if you handle your own shopping from now on. We're both so busy, and it's important for you to maintain your independence." Independence. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I didn't want to acknowledge. Independence from the people who were supposed to love me. Independence from the family I'd spent 30 years nurturing and supporting. Independence that felt suspiciously like abandonment, dressed up in more palatable language. Amanda appeared in the doorway at that moment, as if she'd been waiting just out of sight for her cue. "We think it's so important for you to stay active and engaged," she said, her voice bright with the kind of enthusiasm people use when they're trying to convince you that something unpleasant is actually for your own good. "Dependency can be so aging, don't you think? We want you to feel empowered. Empowered. To buy my own groceries when I was sick. To take care of myself when I'd spent decades taking care of everyone else. To be grateful for the privilege of not being a burden to the people who had once considered my care a privilege rather than an obligation." I nodded and smiled, because what else could I do? I thanked them for thinking of my well-being, complimented their thoughtfulness in wanting me to maintain my independence, and quietly added another small death to the growing collection in my chest. The grocery store trip that day was a kind of torture. Every step felt like walking through water, my head pounding and my chest tight with congestion. Other shoppers moved around me with the quick efficiency of people who had families waiting for them at home. People who would return to houses where someone would ask about their day and offer to help carry the bags inside. I stood in the soup aisle for longer than necessary, staring at the rows of canned chicken soup and remembering the times Lucas had begged me to make his grandmother's recipe when he was sick. "Store-bought soup doesn't taste like love," he used to say, snuggled under blankets on the couch while I simmered chicken bones and vegetables for hours to create something that would heal both his body and his spirit. Now he was content to let me heal myself with whatever I could afford from a can, as if my illness was simply another inconvenience to be managed efficiently rather than an opportunity for the kind of tenderness that had once defined our relationship. When I returned home, carrying groceries that felt heavier than they should have, Amanda was entertaining friends in the living room, my living room, though I'd stopped thinking of it that way. They were women like her, perfectly dressed and articulately opinionated, discussing restaurants I'd never been to and vacation destinations that existed beyond my economic reality. "Oh, Fiona's back from her shopping adventure," Amanda announced as I struggled through the front door with my bags. "Isn't it wonderful how active she stays? So inspiring to see someone her age maintaining such independence." Her friends murmured appropriate responses, their voices carrying that particular tone of admiration reserved for elderly people who perform basic life tasks without requiring assistance. I felt like a pet being praised for a particularly clever trick, a source of mild entertainment rather than a person deserving of genuine respect or consideration. That night, I lay in my bed, the guest room that had become my permanent quarters when Amanda decided the master bedroom needed a sitting area more than I needed proximity to the memories Richard and I had created there, and listened to Lucas and Amanda discussing plans for a weekend trip to wine country. Their voices carried through the thin walls, animated with excitement about tastings and bed and breakfasts and couples massages at some spa I'd never heard of. There was no mention of whether I might like to join them. No acknowledgement that I might enjoy a change of scenery or that my presence might add, rather than detract from their experience. I had become the family member who was cared for through absence rather than inclusion, loved best when I required the least attention. I pulled Richard's pillow closer to my chest, one of the few possessions Amanda had allowed me to keep when she'd updated the bedroom linens, and breathed in the fading scent of his cologne. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered to his memory. "I don't know how to be invisible in my own life." But the house had no answers for me. Only the sound of my son and his wife planning a future that didn't include me, building memories in spaces I'd created, but was no longer welcome to fully inhabit. Desperation makes you do things you never thought you'd have to do. It makes you audition for roles you once held by birthright, perform for affection that used to flow naturally, and beg for attention from people who once sought yours. I found myself studying Amanda like a student preparing for an exam, trying to decode the formula that had transformed my loving son into someone who saw me as a burden rather than a blessing. I started cooking the meals she preferred, hoping that if I could please her palate, I might earn a place at my own table. I learned to make quinoa salads and kale smoothies, foods that tasted like punishment but represented progress in Amanda's world of optimal nutrition and sophisticated tastes. I bought a cookbook called Clean Eating for Modern Families and spent my limited budget on ingredients that promised to transform not just meals, but the people who ate them. "This is actually quite good," Amanda said one evening, taking a careful bite of the grain bowl I'd spent 2 hours preparing. "Much healthier than all that heavy comfort food you used to make. Lucas's digestive system is probably thanking you." Lucas nodded approvingly, though I caught him glancing wistfully at the leftover pizza Amanda had ordered for herself when she'd decided my healthy dinner wasn't quite what she was craving. "It's great, Mom," he said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone trying to convince himself as much as me. "Really nutritious." Nutritious. When had food become about nutrition rather than nourishment? When had the meals I'd prepared with love for 30 years become evidence of my failure to understand what my son really needed? I tried adopting Amanda's interests, hoping that common ground might bridge the growing distance between us. I attempted to engage her in conversations about interior design, nodding enthusiastically when she showed me magazine pictures of homes that looked like museum displays, rather than places where families lived and laughed and made messes together. "I've been thinking about the living room," I said one afternoon, trying to sound casual rather than desperate. "Maybe we could incorporate some warmer colors, something that might make the space feel more lived in?" Amanda's smile was the kind reserved for people who've just revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of something important. "Oh, Fiona," she said, her voice dripping with the patience she might show to a small child who'd suggested painting the sky purple. "Warm colors are so dated. Cool tones create a sense of sophistication and calm. Trust me, I have an eye for these things. An eye for these things." As if aesthetic appreciation was a talent some people possessed and others lacked. As if my decades of creating a home that had sheltered and comforted my family were evidence of deficient taste rather than different priorities. The library had always been my sanctuary, The place where I'd spent countless afternoons reading to Lucas when he was small, where we'd done homework together through his school years, where Richard and I had shared quiet evenings with our books and each other's comfortable presence. Now it had become Amanda's home office, filled with her computer and exercise equipment and motivational posters that announced things like, "Success is a choice," and "Optimize your life." "I hope you don't mind," she'd said when I discovered the transformation, "but I really needed a dedicated workspace. And you can still read in the living room. There's so much more natural light there." The living room, where the television played constantly and where Amanda's friends gathered to discuss their busy, important lives, where quiet contemplation had been replaced by ambient noise and strategic networking, where reading had become a solitary activity performed in the margins of other people's more pressing concerns. I tried joining their conversations, hoping that if I could prove my relevance to their sophisticated discussions, I might earn a more permanent place in my own home. But my attempts at participation were met with the kind of polite attention people show to children who interrupt adult conversations with irrelevant observations. When I was teaching, I began one afternoon, thinking I might contribute to their discussion about education policy. I found that students responded better to encouragement than criticism. "Oh, that's so sweet," Amanda interrupted, her voice bright with condescension. "Old school teaching methods were so much more personal. These days, of course, we understand the importance of evidence-based approaches and measurable outcomes." Her friends nodded knowingly, as if my 3 decades of classroom experience were quaint artifacts from a simpler time when people didn't understand how things really worked. As if love and patience and individual attention were primitive techniques that had been superseded by more scientific approaches to human development. Lucas said nothing during these exchanges, his silence more devastating than any words could have been. The man who had once sought my advice about everything from career decisions to relationship problems now sat passively while his wife dismissed my experience as irrelevant nostalgia. The final humiliation came on my 59th birthday, a day that should have been a celebration of survival and growth, but instead became a masterclass in being overlooked in your own life. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. Not because I expected elaborate festivities, but because birthdays had always been important in our family. Richard had made each one special with small, thoughtful gestures. Flowers picked from our garden, breakfast in bed, a card with a handwritten message that made me feel seen and valued. I woke that morning to silence. No happy birthday from the kitchen, no special breakfast, no acknowledgement that this day was different from any other. Lucas had already left for work, and Amanda was in the shower, preparing for whatever important activities filled her perfectly organized schedule. I made my own coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunrise paint the walls of a house that no longer felt like home. The calendar on the refrigerator, Amanda's streamlined digital version that had replaced my handwritten one with its birthday reminders and anniversary notes, showed no special marking for this date. I had become invisible even to time itself. By evening, I began to wonder if they'd forgotten entirely. Perhaps Lucas was planning a surprise, or maybe they'd decided to celebrate over the weekend when they had more time. I found reasons to stay in the common areas, available for whatever acknowledgement might come, trying to look naturally busy rather than expectantly waiting. Dinner came and went, with no mention of the date. Amanda discussed her upcoming yoga retreat. Lucas complained about a difficult client, and I sat between them like a ghost at her own birthday party, seen but not truly present, occupying space but not mattering enough to command attention. It was nearly 9 o'clock when Lucas suddenly looked up from his phone with an expression of dawning horror. "Oh my God," he said, his face going pale with the realization of forgotten obligation. "Mom, I'm so sorry. Work has been so crazy, and Happy birthday." The words felt hollow, delivered with the panicked enthusiasm of someone trying to retroactively create meaning for a moment that had already passed. Amanda looked genuinely surprised, as if this information was new to her despite living in the same house and sharing the same calendar system. "Oh my goodness, Fiona," she exclaimed, her voice bright with the kind of overcompensation that made the oversight feel even more painful. "We should do something special. It's not too late. Lucas, we should take her out for dessert somewhere nice." But it was too late. Not for dessert, not for belated celebration, but for the feeling that my existence mattered enough to remember without prompting. The damage had been done by the hours of invisibility, by the slow realization that I had become someone whose birthday could slip by unnoticed by the people who were supposed to love me most. "That's okay," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "It's been a lovely day. Really." The lie came easily, a small mercy I offered them to avoid the discomfort of witnessing their guilt. But something shifted inside me in that moment, a subtle realignment that I didn't fully understand yet. The disappointment was there, sharp and familiar, but underneath it was something else, a quiet recognition that I had been accepting crumbs when I deserved a feast, grateful for scraps of attention when I should have demanded the full meal of love and respect. That night, lying in my narrow bed in a room that had never learned to feel like mine, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't going to audition for their affection anymore. I wasn't going to contort myself into shapes that pleased them while diminishing me. I wasn't going to be grateful for the privilege of being barely tolerated in my own life. Something had awakened in me during those hours of forgotten birthday silence. Not anger exactly, but something more powerful. A memory of who I used to be before I started apologizing for taking up space, before I began measuring my worth by other people's convenience. I had been Fiona Morrison before I became Lucas's mother, before I became Richard's wife, before I became Amanda's inconvenient houseguest. I had been a person with thoughts and dreams and value that existed independent of my usefulness to others. And perhaps, I thought as sleep finally came, it was time to remember her. There comes a moment in every woman's life when she stops fighting for spaces that were never truly hers to begin with, when the exhaustion of constantly proving your worth becomes heavier than the fear of being worthless. I reached that moment on a gray March morning when I overheard a conversation that wasn't meant for my ears, but was clearly about my future. I'd been returning from my morning walk, a new habit I'd developed partly for exercise and partly to give Amanda and Lucas time alone in the house without my unwelcome presence, when I heard their voices through the kitchen window. Something about the tone made me pause by the garden gate, my hand frozen on the latch as their words carried through the crisp morning air. "She's just so there all the time," Amanda was saying, her voice carrying the weary frustration of someone discussing a persistent problem. "I mean, I try to be understanding, but it's like having a sad puppy following you around everywhere. It's exhausting. A sad puppy. That's what I'd become in my own home, a creature to be pitied and managed rather than a person to be loved and respected." I stood there among the daffodils I'd planted 20 years ago, watching them push bravely through the soil toward a spring they trusted would come, and felt something inside me wither in a way that had nothing to do with seasons. "I know it's difficult," Lucas replied, and I held my breath waiting for him to defend me, to remind his wife that I was his mother who had sacrificed everything for his happiness. "But she's family. We can't just what?" Amanda's voice sharpened with the impatience of someone who'd been having this conversation for longer than I'd realized. "Lucas, be honest. When was the last time you actually enjoyed spending time with her? When was the last time she contributed anything meaningful to our life together?" The silence that followed was more devastating than any words could have been. I waited for him to protest, to list the ways I'd supported him, to remember the woman who'd sat up all night when he had pneumonia at age 7, who'd worked double shifts to pay for his college textbooks, who'd held him when his father died and promised we'd get through it together. Instead, I heard the sound of him sighing, a long, defeated exhale that carried the weight of a son who'd grown tired of the mother who'd given him everything. "You're right," he said finally, each word landing like a stone in my chest. I don't know what to do about it. She has nowhere else to go. Nowhere else to go. As if I was a stray cat who'd wandered into their lives rather than the woman who'd given birth to him, raised him, loved him unconditionally for 31 years. As if my presence in his life was an accident of circumstance rather than a choice born of love. "There are places," Amanda said, her voice taking on the practical tone she used when solving problems. "Nice places. Assisted living communities where she'd have people her own age, activities designed for seniors. She might even be happier." Assisted living. I was 59 years old, in perfect health, with a mind as sharp as it had ever been. But somehow I'd become someone who needed to be managed and entertained by professionals rather than loved and included by family. We could tell her it's temporary, Amanda continued, warming to her theme, just until she gets back on her feet, finds her own place. But honestly, Lucas, I think she's become too dependent on us. It's not healthy for any of us. Dependent. The word had become Amanda's favorite weapon, used to transform every act of love into evidence of inadequacy. I'd become dependent for wanting to share meals with my family, dependent for hoping to be included in conversations, dependent for expecting that the people who claimed to love me might occasionally act like it. I stood there in my garden, surrounded by the flowers Richard and I had planted together, the roses we'd trained to climb the trellis beside our bedroom window, the herb garden where I'd taught Lucas to distinguish between oregano and basil when he was small enough to need a step stool to reach the raised beds. Everything around me spoke of roots, of growth, of belonging to a place through years of tending and care. But according to my son and his wife, I was a weed that needed to be transplanted somewhere more suitable, somewhere my presence wouldn't interfere with the carefully cultivated life they were trying to grow without me. I turned away from the window and walked slowly through the neighborhood where I'd lived for nearly 3 decades, past houses where I'd watched children grow up, where I'd attended block parties and holiday celebrations, where neighbors had once waved from their yards and stopped to chat about gardens and grandchildren. Now I felt like a tourist in my own life, observing from the outside a community I'd once been part of, but no longer truly belonged to. The park where I'd pushed Lucas on swings and taught him to ride his bicycle looked smaller than I remembered. The playground equipment updated with modern safety features that eliminated the gentle risks that had once made childhood feel like an adventure. I sat on a bench that faced the pond where we'd fed ducks every Sunday after church, where Lucas had announced his engagement to Amanda with such joy that I'd pushed aside my instinctive reservations and focused only on his happiness. How had I become the villain in my own son's love story? When had caring for him transformed from a privilege into a burden? At what point had my presence in his life shifted from a source of comfort to an obstacle to his growth? The ducks were still there, paddling serenely across the water as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis to reveal that love could be conditional, that family could be temporary, that the people you'd die for might secretly wish you'd disappear. I watched an elderly man feeding breadcrumbs to the ducks, his movements careful and deliberate, his face peaceful in a way that suggested he'd found contentment in simple pleasures. He looked up and nodded at me with the friendly recognition that strangers often share in public spaces, and for a moment I felt seen in a way I hadn't experienced in months. "Beautiful day," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who still believed in the kindness of casual human connection. "Yes," I agreed, though the March air was cold and the sky promised rain. "Beautiful." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, 2 people who understood that sometimes the most honest conversations happen without words. When he stood to leave, he tipped his hat to me with old-fashioned courtesy and said, "Have a wonderful day, dear." Dear. Such a simple word, but it had been so long since anyone had addressed me with casual affection that it almost brought tears to my eyes. This stranger had offered me more warmth in 5 minutes than I'd received from my own family in months. That evening, I sat at the dinner table and watched Amanda and Lucas discuss their plans for the weekend. A wine-tasting event with friends I'd never met, followed by a couple's massage at some expensive spa. Their voices were animated with excitement, their faces glowing with the anticipation of shared pleasures and intimate time together. I wasn't invited. Not directly excluded, because that would have required acknowledging my existence, but simply not considered as someone whose presence might add to their enjoyment. I had become background noise in my own life, a piece of furniture that occasionally spoke but never quite warranted a response. "That sounds lovely," I said when they paused in their planning. "You both work so hard. You deserve some time to relax." They smiled at me with the kind of surprised gratitude people show when a pet performs an unexpectedly clever trick. As if my approval was unnecessary but mildly pleasant to receive. That night, I lay in my narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around me. In the distance, I could hear Amanda and Lucas talking and laughing in their bedroom. their voices carrying the intimate rhythm of people who belonged together, who shared secrets and dreams, and a future that didn't include me. The photo on my nightstand showed Richard and me on our wedding day, both of us impossibly young and confident in a love that seemed strong enough to weather anything life might throw at us. He'd been gone for 3 years, but suddenly I felt like I'd lost him all over again, not just his presence, but the life we'd built together, the family we'd created, the legacy of love I'd thought would outlast us both. "I don't know how to do this," I whispered to his picture, as I had so many nights before. "I don't know how to exist in a world where I'm not wanted." But even as I spoke the words, something stirred in the darkness of my despair. A memory of Richard's voice, strong and clear, saying something he'd told me when I doubted myself during a difficult period at school. "Fiona, my love, you're stronger than you know, and when you remember that strength, the world better watch out." I'd forgotten about that conversation until now. Forgotten the woman I'd been before grief and loneliness had convinced me that my worth depended on other people's approval. But lying there in the darkness, something began to shift inside me. Not hope exactly, but something more powerful. A recognition that I still had something left. Something they'd overlooked in their careful inventory of my inadequacies. Something that had been sleeping but wasn't dead. I wasn't just a sad puppy or a dependent burden or a problem to be solved. I was Fiona Morrison, and I still had cards to play. There's a peculiar clarity that comes when you stop trying to be someone else's version of who you should be. Like taking off glasses that were the wrong prescription. Suddenly the world comes into focus in ways that surprise you. I'd spent months trying to shrink myself into a shape that would fit Amanda's vision of an acceptable mother-in-law. But once I stopped contorting myself for their approval, I began to see things I'd been too desperate to notice before. Amanda's perfection wasn't as effortless as she wanted everyone to believe. I started paying attention during my newly quiet days, observing rather than participating, watching instead of performing. What I discovered was a woman who worked very hard to maintain an image that required constant vigilance and considerable resources. Her morning routine alone was a 2-hour production involving dozens of products, each one promising to solve problems I'd never known existed. Her natural beauty required an arsenal of cosmetics applied with surgical precision. Her effortless style demanded clothes that cost more than I'd once spent on household expenses for an entire month. Her social media presence, which she curated with the intensity of a museum director, required her to document every meal, every outfit, every moment of apparent spontaneous joy for an audience of people she'd never met but desperately wanted to impress. I began to understand that Amanda's criticism of my simple ways wasn't really about my inadequacies. It was about her own insecurities. My contentment with small pleasures threatened her belief that happiness required constant acquisition and improvement. My ability to find joy in things that cost nothing challenged her worldview that value could only be measured in dollars and status symbols. More importantly, I started watching Lucas with the eyes of a mother rather than a supplicant. The son I'd been so desperate to please was not the confident, successful man Amanda presented to the world. He was tired, stressed, and increasingly hollow behind his expensive suits and professional achievements. He worked longer hours than ever before, came home exhausted and irritable, and seemed to find little pleasure in the sophisticated life his wife had crafted for them. I noticed how he flinched slightly when Amanda corrected his table manners in front of guests, how his shoulders tensed when she rearranged his appearance before they went out, how he sometimes looked longingly at the simple pleasures he'd once enjoyed, watching baseball games, reading mystery novels, eating comfort food, before catching himself and resuming the more refined interests Amanda had helped him develop. My son, I realized, was as much a victim of Amanda's relentless optimization as I was. He'd traded his authentic self for a version that photographed better, earned more money, and met with Amanda's approval. But in the process, he'd lost something essential. The easy laugh I remembered, the gentle humor that had once defined him, the capacity for simple happiness that had made him such a joy to raise. This understanding shifted something fundamental in my approach to our household dynamics. Instead of trying to earn my place through performance, I began to observe Amanda's methods with the analytical skills I'd developed during 30 years of teaching teenagers. Classroom management, I'd learned long ago, required understanding the psychology behind difficult behavior rather than simply reacting to its surface manifestations. Amanda, I came to realize, was a masterful manipulator who'd perfected the art of making her demands sound like suggestions, her criticism like helpful advice, her control like loving concern. She'd isolated Lucas from friends who didn't meet her standards, convinced him that his family background was somehow inadequate for his professional aspirations, and gradually replaced every source of joy in his life with more sophisticated alternatives that required her expertise to navigate. But manipulation, no matter how skillfully executed, left traces, and I'd become very good at reading between lines, at understanding what people weren't saying as much as what they were. I started noticing Amanda's laptop, left open on the kitchen counter while she took her elaborate morning showers. The screen would display email conversations, social media interactions, text message threads that painted a picture quite different from the devoted wife she presented to Lucas and the world. At first, I tried to look away. Privacy was sacred in my generation, and reading someone else's correspondence felt like a violation of principles I'd held my entire life. But as I watched my son grow increasingly hollow and distant, as I witnessed the systematic destruction of his connection to everything and everyone who had once mattered to him, I began to question whether politeness was worth more than his well-being. The discovery happened by accident. I was wiping down the kitchen counter after Amanda had left for one of her yoga classes, and her laptop had gone to sleep, displaying her desktop background, a photograph from their honeymoon that looked like a magazine spread. But when I accidentally bumped the trackpad while cleaning around it, the screen came alive, revealing an email conversation that made my blood run cold. "The mother-in-law situation is getting ridiculous," Amanda had written to someone named Jessica. "She's like a sad ghost haunting the house, and Lucas feels too guilty to do anything about it. I'm going to have to handle this myself." Jessica's response was equally illuminating. "You've managed more difficult situations before. Remember how you convinced Marcus that his ex-wife was poisoning his kids against him? Same strategy. Make Lucas see that his mother is holding him back from his full potential." Marcus, another ex-husband apparently. Another man who'd been convinced to abandon his previous loyalties in favor of Amanda's vision of success. I scrolled further, my hands trembling as I discovered months of correspondence that revealed Amanda's relationships with Lucas as part of a pattern rather than a love story. She'd targeted him specifically because of his potential, his stable job, his inherited property, his trusting nature. She'd researched his background, learned about his recent loss, identified his vulnerabilities, and crafted her approach accordingly. What I'd taken for instant chemistry had been a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to capture a man when he was most susceptible to promises of a better life. But even more disturbing than her calculated pursuit of my son was her ongoing correspondence with other men, wealthy clients from her previous job, divorced executives she'd met at networking events, anyone who might represent a step up from Lucas when she grew tired of her current situation. "Elle is sweet but limited," she'd written to someone called Trevor just last week. "Great for rebuilding after the Marcus disaster, but I'm ready for the next level. The house has good equity, and I've been positioning myself for a clean exit." A clean exit. My son, who'd opened his heart and home to this woman, who'd restructured his entire life around her preferences, who'd alienated his own mother in pursuit of her approval, was nothing more than a temporary stop on Amanda's journey towards something she considered more worthy of her ambitions. I sat there in my kitchen, our kitchen, the kitchen where I'd fed my family for decades, staring at evidence of a betrayal so complete and calculating that it took my breath away. This wasn't just infidelity or even simple gold digging. This was psychological warfare conducted against a man whose only crime had been loving someone who saw his devotion as weakness to be exploited. But along with the horror came something unexpected: relief. For months, I'd questioned my own judgment, wondered if I was simply a bitter old woman who couldn't accept her son's happiness. I'd blamed myself for being unable to connect with Amanda, convinced myself that my discomfort was evidence of my own inadequacy, rather than legitimate intuition. Now I understood that my instincts had been accurate all along. The coldness I'd sensed beneath Amanda's perfect surface wasn't my imagination. It was real, and it was dangerous. Lucas wasn't pulling away from me because I was embarrassing or burdensome. He was pulling away because he was being systematically isolated by someone who viewed his relationships as obstacles to be eliminated. I closed the laptop carefully, my mind racing with possibilities. The old Fiona might have confronted Amanda directly, might have run to Lucas with printouts and tearful accusations, but months of being dismissed and diminished had taught me something valuable about strategy. Direct confrontation would only result in me being painted as a jealous, interfering mother who couldn't accept her son's choice in women. Amanda was skilled at making herself appear reasonable while making her opponents look unstable. She'd turn any accusations into evidence of my deteriorating mental state, my inability to accept reality, my growing desperation to remain relevant in Lucas's life. No, this situation required subtlety. It required patience. It required the kind of long-term thinking that Amanda believed was beyond my simple provincial capabilities. I'd spent my career teaching teenagers, which meant I'd become an expert in recognizing manipulation, deception, and the careful application of consequences that taught more effectively than any direct confrontation ever could. Some lessons needed to be discovered rather than delivered, experienced rather than explained. Amanda had underestimated me because she'd mistaken kindness for weakness, gentleness for stupidity. She'd assumed that a woman who found joy in simple things must lack the intelligence to understand complex situations. She'd confused my willingness to sacrifice for others with an inability to fight for what mattered. But she was about to learn the difference between a woman who chooses peace and a woman who's simply been waiting for the right moment to act. That evening, I sat at the dinner table and listened to Amanda and Lucas discuss their weekend plans with renewed attention. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, every subtle manipulation she employed was now visible to me in ways it hadn't been before. I watched her redirect conversations away from topics that might make Lucas happy, saw her dismiss his preferences while making her control seem like compromise. "We should really think about that investment opportunity Trevor mentioned," Amanda said casually, cutting her organic salmon into precise pieces. "He says the returns could be substantial, and we need to start thinking more strategically about our financial future." Trevor, the same man she'd been corresponding with about her next-level plans. Lucas nodded thoughtfully, trusting her business acumen, unaware that he was being positioned for his own destruction. I smiled and said nothing, but inside, something fierce and protective was awakening. Something that remembered what it felt like to be a woman who fought for the people she loved instead of apologizing for loving them. Amanda had made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that quiet meant defeated, that silence meant surrender. She was about to discover how wrong she was. Strategic patience is an art form that requires more strength than most people realize. It means watching someone you love walk deeper into deception while you carefully lay the groundwork for their salvation. It means enduring continued cruelty while building the foundation for justice. It means appearing defeated while actually preparing for victory. Over the following weeks, I became a student of Amanda's methods with the dedication of someone whose life's work depended on understanding every nuance of her approach. I documented patterns in her behavior, memorized the names and contact information from her correspondence, and began to understand the full scope of her manipulation with the clarity that comes from finally seeing truth instead of performance. My morning walks became reconnaissance missions. I started varying my routes, timing my returns to coincide with Amanda's activities, learning the rhythm of her days in ways that allowed me to gather information without arousing suspicion. I discovered that her yoga classes were often covers for coffee meetings with men whose names appeared in her email correspondence. Her shopping trips frequently included stops at expensive restaurants where she met clients who seemed more interested in her legs than her business advice. The local library became my headquarters. I'd never been particularly tech-savvy, but desperation makes excellent teachers, and I learned to use public computers with the determination of someone whose son's future depended on her digital literacy. I researched Amanda's background, discovering a trail of broken relationships and financial manipulations that painted a picture of a woman who'd perfected the art of emotional embezzlement. Marcus, her previous husband, had indeed lost custody of his children after Amanda convinced him they were being turned against him by his ex-wife. The court records, available through online databases, showed a man who'd been systematically isolated from his support system, convinced to make financial decisions that benefited Amanda while destroying his relationship with his family. When she'd left him, he'd lost not just his wife, but his home, his savings, and his children's respect. There had been others before Marcus, a pattern of targeting men during vulnerable periods, building dependence, extracting maximum benefit, then moving on when better opportunities presented themselves. Amanda wasn't just a gold digger, she was a professional relationship predator who'd turned emotional manipulation into a profitable career. Armed with this knowledge, I began to plan with the methodical care I'd once applied to creating lesson plans that would reach even the most resistant students. The goal wasn't to destroy Amanda. That would be revenge. And revenge was a luxury I couldn't afford. The goal was to save Lucas while preserving his dignity and our relationship. I started small, with subtle interventions that would plant seeds of doubt without triggering Amanda's defensive responses. I began leaving articles around the house, stories about financial fraud, relationship manipulation, psychological abuse, carefully positioned where Lucas might encounter them during his morning routine or evening relaxation. Nothing too obvious. Nothing that would seem deliberately placed. Just information that might prompt him to think about dynamics he'd been too trusting to question. I also started engaging with neighbors I'd neglected during my months of self-imposed isolation, rebuilding connections with people who remembered Lucas as a boy and might be willing to serve as witnesses if my discoveries ever needed to be substantiated. Mrs. Chen from next door still had security cameras that recorded activity in our shared driveway. Bob Peterson across the street was retired and home during the day, perfectly positioned to observe the comings and goings that Amanda thought went unnoticed. Most importantly, I began documenting everything with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case. I photographed Amanda's correspondence when opportunities arose, noting dates and recipients. I kept a journal of overheard conversations, recording quotes and contexts with the precision I'd once applied to student assessments. I gathered evidence not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because truth sometimes requires proof before it can be believed. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when Amanda made a crucial mistake. She'd received a phone call while she was preparing lunch, thinking I was out on my usual walk. But I'd returned early, entering through the back door and hearing her end of a conversation that revealed the timeline for her clean exit strategy. "I know, Trevor, but these things take time," she was saying, her voice carrying the impatient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a slow learner. "Lucas isn't like Marcus. He's more observant, more emotionally connected to his family. I have to be careful not to trigger any red flags that might make him suspicious." She moved around the kitchen as she talked, her voice occasionally fading as she turned away from where I stood frozen in the back hallway. "No, the mother situation is actually working in my favor," she continued. "The more isolated he becomes from his support system, the more dependent he becomes on me. By the time I'm ready to move on, he'll be so emotionally shattered that he won't have the energy to fight the asset division." Asset division. My son's heartbreak was being planned with the clinical precision of a business merger. His trust was being weaponized against him, his love transformed into leverage for someone else's financial gain. "The timeline is flexible, but I'm thinking late summer," Amanda continued. "That gives me enough time to position the house sale as a mutual decision, maybe convince him we need something bigger for our growing family." Her laugh was cold and calculating. Men are so predictable when you know which buttons to push. I stood there in my own hallway, listening to my son's marriage being dismantled by someone who'd never loved him at all, and felt something crystallize inside me that was harder than anger and more focused than rage. This wasn't just about Amanda anymore. It was about every woman who'd ever been dismissed as harmless, every mother who'd been underestimated because she chose nurturing over aggression, every person who'd been victimized by someone who mistook kindness for weakness. When Amanda finished her call and discovered me in the hallway, her face shifted instantly into its familiar mask of pleasant surprise. "Oh, Fiona, I didn't hear you come in. How was your walk?" "Lovely," I said, meeting her eyes with a calmness that seemed to surprise her. "The weather is perfect for this time of year." Something flickered across her expression, a moment of uncertainty, as if she was trying to determine whether I'd overheard anything significant. But I'd learned to control my face during months of hiding my true feelings, and whatever she saw there apparently reassured her. "I was just organizing our social calendar," she said, gesturing toward her phone with the casual air of someone who had nothing to hide. "So many events coming up. Lucas works so hard. I want to make sure we're making the most of our free time together." Free time that had an expiration date, apparently. Social events that were probably part of her exit strategy. Opportunities to introduce Lucas to the idea that their life together needed upgrading in ways that would benefit her ultimate plans. "That's wonderful," I replied, my voice carrying none of the knowledge that burned in my chest. "You're so good at taking care of him." The irony of the statement seemed lost on her, but I saw satisfaction flash across her features. She believed she'd successfully convinced me of her devotion to my son, had no idea that I now understood the true nature of her care. That evening, I watched Lucas and Amanda interact with the eyes of someone who finally understood the script they were following. Amanda's affectionate touches were strategic, designed to reinforce his dependence on her approval. Her questions about his day were reconnaissance missions, gathering information about his emotional state and professional challenges that she could later use to position herself as his primary source of support and guidance. Lucas, sweet and trusting as he'd always been, responded to her manipulations with genuine gratitude. He thought he'd found a partner who cared about his success, who wanted to help him achieve his full potential. He had no idea he was being systematically isolated and prepared for emotional and financial destruction. The next morning, I made a decision that would have surprised the timid woman I'd been just weeks earlier. I called in a favor from an old colleague who'd become a private investigator after leaving education and arranged for professional documentation of Amanda's activities. Not because I wanted to destroy her, but because Lucas would need undeniable proof when the time came to show him the truth. I also opened my own bank account for the first time in decades, using a small inheritance from my aunt that I'd never touched. It wasn't much money, but it was enough to establish my independence, to ensure that I wouldn't be homeless when Amanda finally convinced Lucas to choose between his wife and his mother. Most importantly, I began preparing Lucas emotionally for what was coming, though he didn't know it yet. I started asking gentle questions about his happiness, his future plans, his feelings about the changes in his life, not probing enough to trigger suspicion, but enough to plant seeds that might make him more receptive to difficult truths when they needed to be revealed. "You seem tired lately," I mentioned one evening as he sat at the kitchen table, reviewing work documents while Amanda was out at another mysterious appointment. "Are you taking care of yourself?" He looked up from his papers with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just busy season at work, Mom. You know how it is." But I could see the strain beneath his professional composure, the exhaustion that came from constantly trying to live up to standards that kept shifting beyond his reach. Amanda had convinced him that his natural self wasn't quite good enough, that he needed constant improvement to deserve the life she was helping him build. "You know," I said carefully, "your father used to say that the right person would love you exactly as you are, not as they think you could become." Something flickered across his face. A moment of recognition, perhaps, or memory of a time when he'd felt accepted, rather than perpetually in need of optimization. But then Amanda's key turned in the front door, and the moment passed as he straightened his shoulders and prepared to perform the role of successful husband for his wife's return. I smiled and retreated to my room, leaving him to his performance while I continued planning for the day when the masks would finally come off and truth would have its moment in the light. Amanda thought she was the only one playing a long game, but she was about to discover that mothers have been protecting their children from predators for thousands of years, and we've learned to be very, very patient when the stakes are high enough. The calm before justice isn't empty waiting. It's the focused preparation that ensures victory when the moment finally arrives. Sometimes justice arrives not with thunderclaps, but with the quiet click of a laptop closing at the wrong moment. Sometimes truth reveals itself not through dramatic confrontations, but through the simple act of someone being in the right place at the right time, with eyes that have finally learned to see clearly. It was a Saturday morning in late April when Amanda's carefully constructed world began to unravel, though she didn't know it yet. Lucas had been called into the office for an emergency client meeting, the kind of weekend crisis that had become increasingly common as Amanda encouraged him to take on more demanding, higher-profile accounts. She'd convinced him that his dedication would be rewarded with the promotions and recognition he deserved, never mentioning that his increased absence from home served her own purposes perfectly. Amanda had planned to spend the day with Trevor, the man who represented her next chapter. Their relationship had progressed from online flirtation to in-person meetings, from emotional affair to detailed planning for a future that would leave my son emotionally and financially devastated. She'd told Lucas she was attending a women's leadership seminar, complete with printed registration materials and a carefully crafted story about networking opportunities that would benefit his career as much as hers. But Trevor had canceled at the last minute, something about his wife becoming suspicious, leaving Amanda stranded with a day she'd expected to spend cementing her exit strategy. She was frustrated, careless in the way people become when their plans are disrupted, and that carelessness created the opening I'd been waiting for. I was in the garden when I heard her phone ring, the sound carrying through the open kitchen window, along with her voice as she answered with an irritation she usually kept better hidden. "What do you mean she found out?" Amanda snapped, her tone sharp with anger. "I thought you said she never checked your phone." I froze among the roses, my pruning shears forgotten in my hand, as I realized this conversation was going to reveal more than Amanda intended to share. "Well, fix it," she continued, her voice taking on the commanding tone she used when things weren't going according to plan. "I can't keep putting my life on hold because you can't manage your domestic situation properly." There was a long pause, during which I could hear the muffled sound of someone speaking rapidly on the other end of the line. Amanda's responses grew increasingly agitated. "No, Trevor. I won't wait and see how things settle down. I've already invested 2 years in positioning myself for this transition, and I'm not going to waste more time because you're having second thoughts." Another pause, shorter this time, followed by Amanda's laugh, cold and calculating in a way that made my skin crawl. "Of course I care about Lucas," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But caring doesn't mean sacrificing my future for his comfort. He'll survive. Men like him always do. They're too weak to fight and too guilty to demand what they deserve. Too weak to fight." She was talking about my son, the boy who'd stood up to bullies twice his size to protect smaller children, the man who'd worked 3 jobs to put himself through college, the gentle soul who'd held me while I cried after his father's funeral and promised we'd get through anything together. "Besides," Amanda continued, warming to her theme, "the mother situation has been perfect for isolating him. By the time I'm ready to move on, he'll be so dependent on me that he'll probably beg me to take half his assets just to avoid the humiliation of admitting he drove his wife away." The pruning shears slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the stone pathway with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the morning quiet. I held my breath, wondering if Amanda had heard, but her conversation continued without interruption. "The beauty of the whole setup is that he'll blame himself," she said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd planned every detail of another person's destruction. "I've spent months convincing him that his mother's neediness and his own emotional limitations are the real problems in our marriage. When I finally leave, he'll think it's because he wasn't good enough, not because I was never invested in the first place." I stood there among the flowers Richard and I had planted together, listening to my son's future being destroyed with surgical precision by someone who'd never loved him at all, and felt something shift inside me that was beyond anger, beyond pain. This was pure protective fury, the kind that mothers feel when their children are threatened by predators who wear familiar faces. The conversation ended with Amanda making plans to meet Trevor the following weekend, assuming his wife would have calmed down by then and he'd be ready to resume their planning sessions. She was already mentally moving on, already focused on the next phase of her life while my son worked late on a Saturday, believing he was building a future with someone who cared about his success. I waited until I heard her footsteps on the stairs, then moved quietly into the house through the back door. Amanda's laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, its screen displaying the email thread she'd been composing during her phone call. A detailed message to Trevor outlining backup plans and alternative timelines for their relationship. This time, I didn't hesitate. I photographed every screen with my phone, capturing not just the immediate conversation, but scrolling through months of correspondence that painted a complete picture of Amanda's deception. The evidence was overwhelming. Detailed discussions of Lucas's financial assets, strategies for emotional manipulation, even mock-ups of the real estate listings she planned to use when she convinced him to sell the house. More damning than any individual message was the timeline revealed by their correspondence. Amanda had been planning her exit strategy since before their first anniversary, researching Lucas's financial situation and building relationships with other men, while he was still in the honeymoon phase of their marriage. Every milestone in their relationship, their first Christmas together, their vacation to Europe, even their discussions about starting a family, had been performance pieces designed to strengthen her position for the eventual betrayal. But it was the final set of messages that made my decision for me. Amanda had been discussing the timeline for removing the mother obstacle, as she'd started calling me in her correspondence with Trevor. The plan was simple and devastating. Convince Lucas that my presence was damaging his mental health and professional prospects, then stage a crisis that would force him to choose between his wife and his mother. The beauty is that he'll make the choice himself, she'd written to Trevor just 3 days earlier. I won't have to be the bad guy. I'll just be the supportive wife who tried her best to make an impossible situation work. By the time it's over, he'll be grateful to me for helping him see that his loyalty to his mother was holding him back from the life he deserves. Holding him back. As if my love for my son was a character flaw that needed to be corrected, rather than a strength that had sustained him through every difficulty he'd ever faced. I closed the laptop carefully and walked to my room, where I sat on my narrow bed and stared at the photographs on my phone screen. The evidence was undeniable. Amanda had never loved Lucas, had never intended to build a life with him, had seen him from the beginning as nothing more than a stepping stone to something better. But evidence, I knew, was only valuable if it was presented at the right moment to someone ready to hear difficult truths. Lucas was still deeply invested in his marriage, still convinced that Amanda's criticisms were evidence of her commitment to helping him improve. He would need to discover her deception in a way that felt organic rather than forced, natural rather than orchestrated. When Lucas returned home that evening, exhausted and frustrated by the client crisis that had consumed his entire Saturday, Amanda was ready with sympathy and solutions. She rubbed his shoulders, prepared his favorite drink, and listened with apparent attention as he described the problems he'd been hired to solve. "You work so hard," she said, her voice warm with what sounded like genuine affection. "They're lucky to have someone as dedicated as you." I watched this performance from the doorway, understanding now that her comfort was strategic rather than caring, designed to reinforce his dependence on her emotional support while positioning herself as the understanding wife who sacrificed her own weekend plans for his career demands. "I'm sorry I missed the seminar," she added with a perfect note of regret. "But Trevor said there might be another one next month, so maybe I'll have better luck with timing then." Trevor. She spoke his name so casually, as if he was simply a business contact rather than the man she was planning to build her next life with. Lucas nodded absently, too tired to notice the subtle satisfaction in her voice when she mentioned these professional development opportunities that were actually romantic appointments. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to the house settle around me, I made a decision that would have shocked the woman I'd been 6 months earlier. I wasn't going to confront Amanda directly or dump evidence on Lucas like a prosecutor making a case. Instead, I was going to let the truth reveal itself in the way that all good teachers know is most effective, through discovery rather than lecture, through experience rather than explanation. Amanda had made one crucial mistake in her planning. She'd assumed that I was defeated, harmless, too broken by months of psychological manipulation to pose any threat to her carefully constructed schemes. She'd underestimated the protective instincts of a mother who'd finally understood the full scope of the danger facing her child. But mothers don't just fight for their children, they fight smart. And Amanda was about to discover that the quiet woman she'd dismissed as a provincial nuisance had been learning from a master manipulator for months, absorbing lessons in strategy and timing that she was finally ready to apply. The day everything changed was coming, but it would arrive on my terms, in my timing, with consequences Amanda had never imagined possible. After all, she'd taught me well. It was time to show her what I'd learned. The end came not with the dramatic explosion I might have orchestrated in my younger, more impulsive years, but with the quiet precision that only comes from understanding that the most powerful truths reveal themselves rather than being forced into the light. Sometimes the best way to expose a lie is simply to step aside and let it collapse under its own weight. My opportunity arrived the following Friday when Amanda made her final, fatal mistake. Trevor had apparently resolved his domestic crisis and was ready to resume their planning sessions. Amanda had told Lucas she was attending another professional development workshop, this one requiring an overnight stay at a downtown hotel where she and Trevor would finalize their strategy for her transition to a new life. But Lucas had surprised her by announcing his intention to attend a work dinner that same evening, a client appreciation event he'd initially planned to skip. Amanda's face had flickered with something that might have been panic before settling back into her usual mask of supportive understanding. "That's wonderful, honey," she'd said, though her voice carried a tension that hadn't been there moments before. "Those networking events are so important for your career development." She'd left that afternoon with an overnight bag and a detailed story about workshops and team-building exercises that would keep her busy until late the following day. Lucas had seemed genuinely disappointed to miss her company, still believing he'd married someone who enriched his life rather than someone who was systematically dismantling it. I waited until evening, until I was certain Lucas would be returning from his dinner, before putting my plan into motion. It was simple, elegant, and required nothing more than ensuring he discovered what Amanda had intended to keep hidden. I called Lucas's cell phone at exactly 9:30, when I knew he'd be driving home from his work event, when his mind would be clear and his defenses would be down. "Lucas," I said when he answered, my voice carrying just enough concern to get his attention without triggering suspicion. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but there's been some kind of emergency. Amanda asked me to tell you to meet her at the Marriott downtown, room 847. She said you'd understand." The lie came easily, justified by months of watching my son be systematically deceived by someone who'd turned manipulation into an art form. If Amanda could use lies to destroy, I could use them to reveal truth. "Room 847? Lucas repeated, confusion evident in his voice. "But she's at a workshop until tomorrow. Are you sure she wanted me to come tonight?" "She seemed quite urgent about it," I said, letting genuine worry color my voice. "She said something about the workshop ending early and needing to see you right away." I could hear the concern in his voice as he agreed to drive to the hotel, the love and devotion that Amanda had been exploiting for 2 years now working in service of truth instead of deception. He would go to that hotel room expecting to find his wife in some kind of crisis, ready to provide whatever support she needed. Instead, he would discover the woman he'd trusted with his heart in bed, with the man she'd chosen to replace him with. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the shadows of a life that had been mine for decades, but would soon belong to someone else entirely. In less than an hour, Lucas would see Amanda as she really was, and our family would be forever changed. But change, I'd learned, wasn't always loss. Sometimes it was liberation. The call came at 10:45. I was sitting in the living room, ostensibly reading but actually listening for the sound of Lucas's car in the driveway, when my phone rang with his number on the display. "Mom." His voice was barely a whisper, broken in ways I hadn't heard since his father's death. "Mom, can you come get me? I can't drive right now." I found him sitting on the curb outside the Marriott, still wearing his suit from the work dinner, but looking like a man who'd aged a decade in the space of an hour. His hands were shaking, his face pale with the kind of shock that comes from having your entire understanding of reality shattered in a single moment. I sat beside him on the cold concrete without saying a word, offering him the same silent presence I'd provided when he was a boy, coming home with scraped knees and broken toys. Some wounds needed witnessing before they could begin to heal. He started, then stopped, unable to complete the sentence that would make his betrayal real. God, Mom, how could I have been so stupid?" "You weren't stupid," I said quietly, my voice carrying none of the anger or vindication I might have expected to feel. "You were trusting. There's a difference." He turned to look at me then, his eyes red with tears he was trying not to shed. And I saw my little boy again, the one who'd come to me with every hurt and disappointment, believing that somehow I could fix whatever was broken in his world. "How long have you known?" he asked, the question carrying weight beyond its simple words. "Known what, exactly?" "That she didn't love me, that I was just some kind of project to her." I could have told him about the emails, the phone calls, the months of evidence I'd gathered documenting Amanda's deception. I could have proven my suspicions, vindicated my instincts, shown him that his mother's concerns had been legitimate all along. Instead, I simply said, "I knew she didn't love you the way you deserved to be loved." We sat there in silence for a while, watching the city move around us while his world rearranged itself into new and painful configurations. When he was ready, I helped him into my car and drove him home to a house that would need to be redefined now that its illusions had been stripped away. Amanda returned the next morning to find her belongings packed and waiting by the front door. Lucas had spent the night in his childhood bedroom, the one room Amanda hadn't been able to completely remake, surrounded by memories of who he'd been before he'd tried to transform himself into someone worthy of her love. The confrontation, when it came, was brief and anticlimactic. Amanda had returned expecting to continue her performance, to maintain her lies until she was ready to execute her planned exit strategy. Instead, she found Lucas sitting at the kitchen table with divorce papers already printed and waiting for her signature. "I know about Trevor," he said simply when she walked through the door. "I know about all of it." To her credit, Amanda didn't try to deny it or spin the situation into something else. Perhaps she recognized that her time was up, that the carefully constructed facade she'd maintained for 2 years had finally crumbled beyond repair. "I see," she said, her voice taking on the cool professionalism she used when one phase of her life was ending and another was beginning. "I suppose congratulations are in order. You finally grew a spine." Even in defeat, she couldn't resist one final attempt at manipulation, one last effort to make him feel like his discovery of her betrayal was somehow a character flaw rather than an act of self-preservation. But Lucas had learned something in that hotel room that no amount of psychological manipulation could undo. He'd seen the person behind Amanda's perfect mask, and he could never unsee it again. The divorce proceedings were swift and surprisingly amicable. Amanda took what she could legally claim and disappeared from our lives with the efficient thoroughness of someone who'd always known this day would come. She left no forwarding address, no explanation, no apology for the damage she'd inflicted on people who'd offered her nothing but love and trust. Lucas struggled in the weeks that followed, questioning every decision he'd made, every change he'd allowed Amanda to orchestrate in his life. The house felt hollow without her constant presence, but it was the emptiness of relief rather than loss, like a fever finally breaking after a long illness. One evening, as we sat in the garden watching the roses I'd refused to let Amanda replace, Lucas turned to me with the kind of serious expression he'd worn as a child when he was trying to work out complex moral problems. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying the weight of months of accumulated guilt. "I let her convince me that you were the problem in our relationship. I chose her over you, and I'm sorry." I looked at my son, this good man who'd been victimized by someone skilled at exploiting decency for personal gain, and felt my heart break a little for all the time we'd lost to Amanda's manipulations. "You don't owe me an apology for loving someone," I said gently. "You owe yourself the promise that you'll never again let anyone convince you that your love is something to be ashamed of." We talked long into the evening, rebuilding connections that Amanda had systematically severed, rediscovering the easy relationship we'd shared before she'd convinced Lucas that his affection for his mother was a sign of emotional immaturity rather than evidence of his capacity for loyalty. As the weeks passed, Lucas began the slow work of reclaiming himself from Amanda's influence. He started cooking the comfort foods she'd convinced him were unsophisticated. He resumed friendships she'd encouraged him to abandon. He bought books for pleasure rather than professional development, watched movies that made him laugh instead of ones that would look impressive on his coffee table. Most importantly, he began to trust his own judgment again, to value his own preferences instead of constantly seeking external validation for his choices. But even as our relationship healed and Lucas rediscovered himself, I knew that something fundamental had changed in our family dynamic. I'd spent months learning to be independent, discovering strengths I'd forgotten I possessed, building a life that belonged entirely to me, rather than existing in the margins of other people's priorities. When Lucas asked me to stay, to help him rebuild the home Amanda had systematically dismantled, I surprised both of us by saying no. "I love you," I told him, sitting in the small apartment I'd rented with money I'd saved from my teacher's pension, and the part-time job I'd found at the local library. I will always love you, but I won't come back to being the mother who lives in the spaces left over from your real life. The apartment was tiny but filled with light, furnished with pieces I'd chosen because they pleased me rather than because they fit someone else's aesthetic vision. Every book, every photograph, every small comfort reflected my own preferences and priorities. For the first time in years, I was living in a space that belonged entirely to me. Lucas visited often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to sit in my garden and talk about his day. Our relationship had been transformed by crisis into something stronger and more honest than it had been before Amanda's arrival. We were no longer connected by obligation or proximity, but by genuine affection and mutual respect. "I'm proud of you, Mom," he said one evening as we shared tea on my small balcony overlooking the park where I'd once fed ducks while my world fell apart around me. "For everything. For saving me from her. For saving yourself from us. Saving yourself from us." Such a simple phrase, but it captured something essential about the journey I'd traveled from invisible houseguest to independent woman. I'd learned that love doesn't require self-erasure, that supporting others doesn't mean sacrificing yourself, that the best gift you can give someone is your authentic self, rather than a diminished version designed to avoid conflict. "I learned something important," I told him as the sun set over the city that had become my home, rather than just the place where I lived. "I learned that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who need to step back and let you find your own way." Amanda had been gone for 6 months when Lucas met Sarah, a teacher like I'd been, who laughed at his jokes and loved his cooking and thought his devotion to his mother was evidence of his character rather than a character flaw. She was nothing like Amanda. Warm where Amanda had been calculating, genuine where Amanda had been performative, interested in building something real rather than acquiring something impressive. At their wedding, a small ceremony in the garden Richard and I had planted decades earlier, I sat in the front row wearing a dress I'd chosen because it made me feel beautiful rather than appropriate. Lucas looked happy in a way he never had with Amanda. Relaxed, authentic, confident in his own worth rather than constantly striving to earn someone else's approval. When he asked me to dance at the reception, he said something that made all the pain of the previous years feel worthwhile. "Thank you for teaching me the difference between someone who loves me and someone who loves what I can do for them." As we swayed to music that celebrated love rather than performing it, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. The woman who'd started this story, broken and invisible in her own life, had discovered something Amanda never understood: that true strength isn't about controlling others, but about knowing yourself, that real love doesn't diminish people, but helps them become more fully who they were meant to be. I'd forgiven Lucas, forgiven Amanda, even forgiven myself for the months I'd spent accepting less than I deserved. But more importantly, I'd learned to insist on more respect, more consideration, more space for my own dreams and preferences. Standing in my son's arms, surrounded by people who valued authenticity over perfection, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply living well, loving fully, and refusing to let other people's limitations define your possibilities. I'd learned that silence can be powerful, that patience can be strategic, and that the quietest victories are often the most complete. And I'd discovered that sometimes, when you stop trying to fit into other people's stories, you finally have room to write your own.